Hello children, my name is Leslie Brett and I've lived a long while. My mother, of course, was younger. She was born in 1905, so she was only 9 when the war started. And so she was just at school sort of thing in the First World War. In the Second World War, the difference to her life was with no child to look after, she was able to work, which was unusual for women with children. Didn't work then in those days. And she worked in Selfridges in Oxford Street, and she quite liked that because you could buy the stuff in Selfridges, the big store, at a less than cost price, you know, if you worked there. I got rather separated from my friend who lived nearest to me, which was bad luck for me because he ended up at the big house on the edge of the village where they had servants and a horse out the back you could ride. There were 3 spinster ladies, they were called in those days, and they were quite well off, and they had a couple of cars, big Morris Cowley cars, and they were quite well off, and they built a Sunday school between the 2 rows of houses in the village, and that was surrounded by gardens, allotments where people grew fruit and vegetables and things like that, which was handy in the war because some food was rationed. There wasn't a school in the village because it was just really 2 rows of new houses. No, we walked about a mile and a quarter down the country lanes, over the bridge where the Liskeard station, and then into the station. And we were in a converted Wesleyan church, or chapel as it was called. And we had our lessons round where the pews were, where there was a second floor with little like classrooms round, made of quite a lot of teachers, and there were several teachers, and they were from London too, although not from our school. I went back to school, in Peckham, and the schools had all been altered. There was they went from 5 up to 14, the junior school and the secondary part of school, because people left school at 14 then. They were merged into one school, Lyndhurst Grove School. And as I lived in Lyndhurst Grove and was only 4 doors from the school, that only took a couple of minutes to get to school. Then I took the 11+ exam. And then I got a scholarship to Wilson's Grammar School, and the school was divided into, the different houses, 6 different houses with different names. And my house was called Whiteley, and there was another house called Wilson after the founder of the school, Edward Wilson, who founded it in 1615. There was an officers' training corps called the OTC, where you had a uniform, a First World War uniform, because they were sort of an old-fashioned type uniform. Yeah, because there was a shortage of meat, because obviously meat couldn't be bought on ships anymore, because the ships had to be used for other things. So there was meat that was grown in the country in England, but it was in short supply, so the meat ration was very small. Rabbits weren't on ration, and we ate quite a bit of rabbit in the war. Oh, there were lots of sweets before the war. There were lots of boiled sweets in big jars. That's mainly what you bought before the war. And there were bars of chocolate. There was Cadbury's milk chocolate. I think Mars bars came in just before the war. Oh, and yes, there was a sort of round chocolate sweets called Dominoes, I think. Oh, Rolos. Well, like most people, the first time I saw TV after the war was for the coronation in 1953 of the present Queen Elizabeth II. The first television I saw was very small. My Aunt Rose had one in about 1946 or 7, and it was very small. It was about 9 inches by 4 inches. Very few people had them in the late 40s, but the coronation came, there was because it was a big event, thousands and thousands were sold. A lot of people had them for the first time in 1953 so that they could watch the coronation. But I'm so old that I can remember television before the war. And there was television in 1937, 8 and 9, before the war, but people didn't have them in their houses. So I first saw television, which was a boxing match between Eric Boone and Arthur Danaher. It was a famous fight, and the kids all looked through the pub door because there was a tiny television up on a shelf in the pub, so that people didn't have them indoors, but places like pubs did have a little set. And it was magic, the idea that you could see people moving about. You know, it was like a radio with pictures. I first owned a television after I got married. That would be at the end of 1957. How old would I have been then? I was just 26. After the war, they had cinemas that were called news theatres, and there was usually 5 cartoons and the news, or there might be 4 cartoons and a picture of a big band, you know, because there weren't little groups then, that there were large bands with about 20 musicians in, you know, really famous bands. Well, mostly I worked in read newspapers and magazines in what was called a press cutting bureau, where we read them and marked them. People cut bits of cuttings of newspapers, and then we sent them to people, and they paid us for them. There was no internet then. If you wanted to make a collection of pictures and things about yourself, you had to cut them out of a newspaper or a magazine and stick them in an album.